not draining. Filling, the final top-off after the replastering crew had finished on Wednesday, and the chemical startup sequence had been running for 36 hours, and the water had reached the correct level, and the automated system had taken over and was doing what it was designed to do. I had removed the pool in January. I was filling it again in April. Karen had called the police in February. The sequence matters, so I will be precise about it. January, I drained and demolished the pool, filled the basin with compacted aggregate and structural fill, poured a concrete slab, and had the space professionally landscaped. All of this was permitted, inspected, documented, and completed in 11 days by a licensed contractor named Marcus Webb, who had done 3 previous projects for me and who understood both the work and the paperwork. February, Karen called the Greenfield Township Police to report that I had destroyed a community amenity and was creating a neighborhood nuisance. April, the new pool was complete, better than the original, deeper, better filtered, heated, with a tiled spa attached and a deck system that Renata had designed, and that was, professionally and objectively, the finest residential pool installation in Greenfield Crossing HOA's history. The sequence had a logic that I had understood since January and that Karen had not understood until April, when the pool truck arrived to do the chemical startup, and she came to her fence and looked at what I had built and what I had built in the space where the demolished pool had been. I want to explain January before I explain February and April, because January is where the story actually starts. My name is Tobias Reeve, 48 years old, 20 years as a licensed mechanical engineer specializing in fluid systems and hydraulic infrastructure, the last 7 running my own consultancy, working on commercial and industrial fluid systems. I understand how water moves, where it goes, what it costs to manage, and what it requires to function correctly. My wife Renata is a licensed landscape architect. She designs outdoor spaces, pools, gardens, terraces, the integration of water features and plantings and hardscape into coherent residential environments. She has won 4 regional awards for residential design and 1 national recognition for a commercial water feature installation in Phoenix. Between us, we were the precise combination of professionals you would want designing and building a pool. We were also the precise combination of professionals you did not want to accuse of destroying a community amenity, when what we had actually done was remove a substandard pool in order to replace it with a better one. The original pool had been installed by the previous owners in 2009, 14 years old when we bought the house. Fiberglass shell, standard filtration, a vinyl liner that had been patched twice and was developing a 3rd area of concern along the deep end wall. The circulation system was undersized for the pool's volume. The heating equipment was original and operating at reduced efficiency. The deck was poured concrete with 3 crack repairs visible from the porch. Renata had assessed the pool the week we moved in and had said, with the professional directness of someone who has spent 20 years evaluating outdoor spaces, that the pool had 5 years at maximum and probably 3 before the liner became a liability. I had assessed the circulation and heating systems and agreed. We had planned the replacement since year 1 of ownership. Renata had been designing the new configuration, a larger pool, properly sized circulation, integrated spa, the tiled finish that is both more durable and more aesthetically correct than vinyl, a deck system in the Brazilian Ipe hardwood she had been working with on 3 recent projects. The design had been complete for 14 months when we finally scheduled the work. We had not replaced the pool earlier because the design was complex, the permitting was detailed, and Marcus Webb, who was the only contractor I trusted with this scope of work, had not had an opening in his schedule until January. January had been the opening. We had taken it. Karen Whitmore Aldridge had lived in the house directly behind ours for 6 years. She was 53, former public relations director for a regional hospital system, and had the specific combination of communication skill and institutional instinct that makes certain people very effective at shaping narratives when they want to and very committed to those narratives once they have shaped them. The narrative Karen had shaped, in the 6 years before our pool replacement, was that the HOA's community was enriched by the social and aesthetic presence of our pool. She had organized pool gatherings, always with our permission, always enjoyable, but organized with Karen's energy and Karen's social network in ways that had, over 6 years, created in the Greenfield Crossing community an association between Karen's social calendar and our pool's availability. We had never agreed to be a community pool. We had agreed, repeatedly and specifically, to host gatherings that Karen organized. These are different things. Karen understood them to be the same thing. This understanding was the foundation of everything that followed. The demolition permit was filed in November. The construction permit for the new pool was filed simultaneously. Both were approved in December. The work was scheduled for January and February, with the new pool targeted for April completion. I had notified the HOA board in writing in December, a courtesy notification, since permitted work on private property requires no HOA approval, but because I had been an HOA member for 4 years and understood that courtesy notifications prevented misunderstandings that formal authority alone could not prevent. I had not notified Karen. I had no obligation to notify Karen. Karen was my neighbor. She was not a stakeholder in my pool. Marcus's crew arrived January 7th. The demolition began January 8th. The pool was empty by January 9th. The shell was removed by January 11th. The basin was filled and the slab was poured by January 17th, and the landscaping was complete by January 18th. 11 days. The space where the pool had been was, by January 18th, a clean concrete slab surrounded by fresh ground cover, looking like a patio that had always been a patio. Karen had not been home during the week of demolition. She had been visiting family out of state, which I know because she had mentioned the trip at the December neighborhood gathering where we had last spoken. She came home January 20th. She called me at 3:47 January 20th. She said, "Where is the pool?" I said, "It's been removed." She said, "Removed?" I said, "The pool was at the end of its functional life. We are having it replaced with a new installation." She said, "Replaced?" I said, "The new pool is under permit. Construction begins February." She said, "You took the pool out?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Without telling anyone?" I said, "I notified the HOA board in December. The work was permitted. There was no requirement to notify neighbors." She said, "You should have told me." I said, "Karen, it's our pool, on our property. We removed it in January to replace it in February." She said, "People were counting on it." I said, "People were counting on it for what?" She said, "The spring gathering. I've already told people it's at your place." I said, "You scheduled a gathering at our property without asking us." She said, "It's always been at your place in April." I said, "With our permission each time, which you did not ask for this year." She said, "I assumed." I said, "Karen, the pool is being replaced. The new pool will be ready in April. Any gathering would need to wait until then and would need to be discussed with us in advance, as they always should have been." She said, "You should have told me." I said, "I'm telling you now." She hung up. The February call to the police happened 12 days later. I was at my office when Renata called at 10:43 to tell me a Greenfield Township police officer was at our front door. I drove home. Officer Patricia Reeves was on our porch with the patient expression of a police officer who has attended enough civilian calls to know within 30 seconds whether she is dealing with something serious. She had attended this call and had established within 30 seconds that she was not. She said when I arrived, "Mr. Reeve, I received a call reporting that you had destroyed a community amenity and were creating a nuisance at this address." I said, "We removed our private residential pool in January. It was at the end of its functional life. It's being replaced by a new installation currently under construction. She said the caller stated the pool was a community resource. I said the pool was our private property. It was on our lot, permitted in our name, maintained at our expense. She said the caller stated that community members had relied on access to the pool and that its removal caused harm. I said the pool was private. We occasionally hosted gatherings at our property with specific permission given for each event. We had no obligation to continue hosting gatherings or to maintain the pool for community use. She said, "Is the removal permitted?" I said, "Demolition permit number 2024 D1847, filed November, approved December, work completed January 18th. I have the permit and the inspection certificates inside." I went inside and returned with the demolition permit, the construction permit for the new pool, the contractor's completion documentation, and the HOA notification letter from December. Officer Reeves reviewed all of it. Then she said, "And the construction permit for the new pool." I said, "The new pool is under construction now. Expected completion April. The new installation will be larger and better equipped than the original." She looked at the construction permit for a long moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "You removed the pool to replace it with a better pool." I said, "Yes." She said, "And the caller reported this as destruction of a community amenity." I said, "Karen believed the pool was a community resource. It was not. It was our private property." She said, "I see." She handed the documents back. "Mr. Reeve, everything here is in order. The removal was permitted, the replacement is permitted, and there is no actionable situation at this address." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I'll note in my report that the caller's characterization of the property as a community amenity was not accurate." I said, "I'd appreciate that." She said, "I do want to mention the caller was quite distressed. Whether there's a conversation worth having with your neighbor about expectations, I'll leave to you." I said, "I've had it." She nodded, "Have a good afternoon." She left. I called Leonard that evening. Leonard had been our HOA and property attorney since year 2 of our residence and was familiar with Karen's social organizational style and its relationship to our property. I described the police call. He said, "She called 911 because you removed your own pool." I said, "Non-emergency line, but yes." He said, "To report that you destroyed a community amenity." I said, "The officer noted in her report that the characterization was inaccurate." He said, "Good." He paused. "Solomon, Tobias, what's the documentation situation?" I said, "I have the police report. I have the permits. I have the HOA notification. I have 6 years of gathering authorization emails where Karen asked to host events and we gave specific, written, per-event permission." He said, 6 years of per-event authorizations." I said, "Every gathering was specifically authorized in writing. I have 43 emails." He said, "You have 43 emails establishing that the gatherings were authorized on a per-event basis, rather than through any standing arrangement." I said, "Yes." He said, "Because you're a mechanical engineer who documents things." I said, "I document things, yes." He said, "What are you planning?" I said, "I'm planning to finish the pool. I'm planning to send Karen a letter, through you, clarifying the nature of the prior arrangement and establishing that no standing access agreement exists or has ever existed. And I'm planning to present the complete documentation to the HOA board at the next regular meeting so the community has accurate information." He said, "The letter first." I said, "The letter first." Leonard sent the letter the following week. It was 6 paragraphs. The first paragraph established that our pool had been our private property throughout our ownership. The second paragraph noted that we had graciously permitted community gatherings on a specific, per-event basis over 6 years. The third paragraph included a representative list of the 43 authorization emails demonstrating the per-event nature of the permission. The fourth paragraph stated clearly that no standing access arrangement had ever existed and that Karen's characterization of the pool as a community amenity was factually incorrect. The fifth paragraph noted the February police call and its outcome. The sixth paragraph established that any future gathering at our property would require advance written authorization, that this had always been the arrangement, and that no future gathering would be assumed without such authorization. Karen did not respond to the letter. Her husband Richard called me 3 days after the letter was delivered. He said, "She's not going to call you." I said, "I gathered." He said, she's having difficulty with the situation." I said, "Richard." Karen organized community events using our property as though she had standing access. She did not have standing access. When we exercised our right as property owners to renovate our pool, she called the police. He said, "I know." I said, "The police officer noted in her report that the community amenity characterization was inaccurate." He said, "I know." He paused. "She genuinely believed it was shared. Not legally, she knows it was your property, but socially. She believed she had built something and that removing the pool was removing what she built." I said, "She built a social calendar on our property without our full understanding of the scope she was attaching to it." He said, "Yes." He paused again. "The new pool." I said, "Will be ready in April." He said, "Will there be gatherings?" I said, "With advance written authorization for each event, as there always should have been." He said, "She's going to want to organize." I said, "Richard, if Karen wants to organize a gathering at our property, she can ask us. We will consider each request individually. That's how it should have worked from the beginning." He said, "She won't ask. She doesn't ask. That's who she is." I said, "Then there won't be gatherings." He was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry for the police call. She shouldn't have done that." I said, "The officer sorted it out." He said, "I know. I saw the report." I said, "Richard, the new pool is going to be exceptional. Renata has been designing it for 14 months. When it's complete, it's going to be the finest residential pool in this HOA. If Karen wants to organize events there, she can ask. That offer stands." He said, "She won't." I said, "I know." The HOA meeting was the regular March session. Harold Webb, our board president, a retired civil engineer who had been running the board for 7 years, had added the pool situation to the agenda at my request. 29 of 56 households attended. I presented the documentation, the 43 authorization emails summarized by year, the December HOA notification, the demolition permit, the February police call and Officer Reeves's report, including her notation that the community amenity characterization was inaccurate, and the construction permit for the new pool. I said I want the community to have accurate information about what happened and why. Our pool was private property. We maintained it at our own expense for 14 years before buying this house and for 4 years after. We gave specific written permission for each event hosted at our property. No standing access arrangement ever existed. I said the new pool is better than the original in every technical and aesthetic dimension. It will be ready in April. It will remain private property. Any future gathering at our property will require advance written authorization from us. I said I'm not raising this to be adversarial. I'm raising it because 6 years of social arrangements built on assumptions rather than explicit agreements created a situation where my neighbor called the police when I exercised my property rights. That is the consequence of assumed arrangements. Explicit agreements prevent this. Harold said, "The board will note this in the minutes and will send a community reminder that private property is private property regardless of its social use history." The reminder went out the following week. Karen did not attend the HOA meeting. Harold had told me before the meeting that she had sent an email saying she was unwell. Richard attended. He sat in the back row. He left before the parking lot conversation phase. April 15th. The chemical startup was running. The new pool was at temperature. The deck was finished, Renata's Ipe hardwood, exactly as she had designed it, the color of dark honey in the afternoon light. The spa was operational, the jets calibrated, the tiling precisely what she had specified. Renata stood at the pool edge and looked at what 14 months of design had produced. She said, "It's exactly right." I said, "Yes." She said, "The original pool was never this good." I said, "No." She said, "Karen organized gatherings for a pool that was not as good as this one." I said, "Yes." She said, "And when we removed it to build something better, she called the police." I said, "Yes." She looked at the water for a moment. The new pool was 12 feet longer than the original, properly heated, the circulation system designed to my specification, the chemical management automated. The tiled finish caught the afternoon light differently than vinyl does, more depth, more reflectance, the specific quality of a surface that has been correctly specified. She said, "Are we going to have anyone over?" I said, "Next month. I was thinking the Morrisons and the Webbs." She said, "Not Karen." I said, "If she asks, we'll consider it." She said, "She won't ask." I said, "No." She said, "Richard might." I said, "Possibly." She looked at the pool for another long moment. She said, "The police officer noted in her report that the community amenity characterization was inaccurate." I said, "Yes." She said, "And now there's a better pool." I said, "Yes." She said, "Karen called the police on the demolition of the pool that became the foundation for the pool that is now better than what she called the police about." I said, "That's the sequence." She said, "That's an extremely precise backfire." I said, "I thought so." She went inside to get towels. I stood at the pool edge alone for a moment. The water was still, the temperature correct, the system running smoothly. The Ipe deck was warm under my feet. The spa was at the far end, integrated cleanly into the design, exactly where Renata had put it in the first sketch 14 months ago. I had documented the sequence, the 43 emails, the December notification, the permits, the police report, the March HOA presentation, all of it complete, organized, filed. The new pool was the final document in the sequence. The pool that Karen had called the police to protect, the old vinyl-lined, undersized circulation, crack deck pool that had been at the end of its functional life, was a concrete slab under Renata's ground cover planting. The pool that existed now was the one we had been planning for 14 months, the one Renata had designed, the one Marcus Webb had built, the one that was, by every objective measure, significantly better than what had been there before. Karen had called the police on the demolition phase of a renovation. The renovation was complete. I sat in one of the deck chairs Renata had specified, teak, the correct weight and proportion for the deck scale, and looked at the water. It was ours, it had always been ours. It was just better now. Framed thumbnail text. She called cops on my pool demo. I was replacing it with a better one.